Dale Carnegie once said, "Remember that a person's name is to that person the sweetest and most important sound in any language." Think about the last time someone remembered your name. How did that make you feel? Are you good at remembering names? Or are you like most of us and think you're lousy at it? If remembering names is hard, this program is for you.
Welcome to Your Invisible Toolbox, the show that provides practical tools to common interpersonal problems we deal with at work.
Psychotherapist Dr. Fran Walfish says if you instantly forget someone's name upon meeting them, it could be that you secretly didn't like them very much. In an article for Bustle, she explains that this has a lot to do with your unconscious mind. This may be true of those we don't like, but what about those we do like and want to remember? Is it really true that we can't remember names? Consider this example from brain coach expert Jim Kwik. Imagine that there's a suitcase of $100,000 cash for you or the charity of your choice if you just remember the name of the next person you meet. Are you going to remember that person's name? Of course you are. So it has nothing to do with your ability to remember a name. It has to do with how important it is to you. Kwik says there's no such thing as good or bad memory. It's just trained and untrained memory. Memory is not something that you have. It's something that you do. It's not a noun. It's a process. Only about a third of your memory is due to genetics, and that leaves 2/3 of memory that can be improved. Memory's not fixed like your shoe size. It's something that you can grow. So, if it isn't faulty memory, what's going on? Could it be our motivation? Did we even let the name in? And if not, why not? We can all recall names if we have a good enough reason to. Dr. Joe Bates, author of Making Your Brain Hum, says if you think back to people that have changed your life or someone you fell in love with, you remembered that person's name. Why? Because they were important to you. Could we, with a little effort, motivate ourselves to remember the names of those that don't matter as much, like that random person at the networking event or a neighbor? Remembering their name would matter to them. Hello, I'm Rowena Crosby.
And I'm Deborah Renner. Thank you for joining us on today's show.
We're excited to welcome you to Tero's new production studio with our new virtual set technology and a brand new show format. What hasn't changed are the useful tools to solve interpersonal challenges at work.
Okay, Ro, so you're saying remembering names is more about motivation than about memory.
Isn't that interesting?
It is.
So many of us feel our ability or inability to remember names lies in our memory, yet before memory comes the motivation to actually receive the name and know the person.
Well, and most of the time we're hearing the name during an introduction, and it takes a certain amount of focus to concentrate actually on the other person rather than on ourselves. So it stands to reason that getting the name and remembering it is challenging.
There's a terrific video put out by ASAP Science called "Why Do You Forget Names?" And this video highlights what they call the next in line effect. Our mind is consumed with what's next, and we never take the name in.
Well, and I think the other thing that video points out is the mental links that we either make or we don't make. So if I hear that you are a baker, I'm making a mental link and I'm thinking about a bakery and I'm having an association. But if you tell me your name is Baker, I don't necessarily have a link, and yet we can form these links.
And they think they call that the Baker effect, don't they?
It is. It's the Baker effect.
So we can program our brains to make these mental links, but we have to want to, and therein lies the motivation piece. Most of us have programmed our minds to do just the opposite. So how many times do we say, "I can't remember names," or "I'm horrible at names"? We just let ourselves off the hook that way.
We really do. So what are some ways we can program ourselves to remember names rather than forget? Let's take a deeper dive. Let's start with a bit of history.
Long-term memory has infinite storage capacity, yet it's still challenging to commit names from short-term to long-term memory. Why is that? Well, it can actually be traced to our use of modern technology.
Historically, oral cultures didn't have to write down information because their brains were wired differently. They were wired to remember and retell stories by word of mouth.
And so why don't we still function like that? Because we don't have to.
As technology advanced, we took oral information, we put it on paper, and we could actually access larger amounts of information, but our memory muscle weakened in that process.
And so technology actually corrodes memory because it eliminates the need for encoding things into our long-term memory. And if you doubt this, try to recall any phone number stored on your device.
Oh, that's so challenging. Getting names into long-term memory is not a necessity anymore. But is it a necessary choice if people are important to us? Let's hear from Michael Libby, who interfaces with a wide range of people in his roles. He's president of Insight Advertising, Marketing and Communications, host of Insight on Business, the News Hour, and executive director of the Windsor Heights Chamber of Commerce.
You know, when it comes to remembering names, one of the things that you need to do for yourself is tell yourself that you do remember names. It's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy if you say, oh, I don't remember names very well. I used to be that way until I realized what Dale Carnegie said years ago, that someone's name, if enunciated correctly, is the sweetest sound that they can hear. So if it's important to the person, it's got to be important to you. So what are the 3 tips that I can offer you as far as remembering names? Well, number 1, you need to repeat it almost immediately after someone that you meet. And then associate it with someone. I met 2 attorneys the other day. Their names were Matthew and James. I go, oh yeah, Bible characters, easy, right? And thirdly, I'm old school, so I tend to write stuff down. And if you write something down, you'll tend to remember it better because we're all visual people. So what are the tips really quick? Number 1, repeat the name right away so that you start to imprint it. Go ahead and somehow associate that name with something else. And number 3, write it down and you'll remember names, a very important part of doing business.
Before we discuss more tips for remembering names, let's test your knowledge with a true-false quiz. Here are 4 questions. Number 1, common names like Nancy and Mike are easier to remember. Number 2, the brain can only hold so much information, and if the brain does not repeat it, the information fades. Number 3, short-term memory can only hold 5 to 9 chunks of information indefinitely. Number 4, faces are easier to recognize than names. Stay tuned for the answers to these questions.
So question number 1, common names like Nancy and Mike are easier to remember. The answer, it's false. Actually, common names that we hear often are less salient when we hear them, and we are less likely to commit them to memory.
It's interesting, isn't it? Number 2, the brain can only hold so much information, and if the brain does not repeat it, the information fades. If you guessed the answer was true, you're correct. The importance of repetition on memory is one of the main features of learning apps. The more times a person recalls a memory, the stronger it becomes, and the easier it is to recall in the future.
Number 3, short-term memory can only hold 5 to 9 chunks of information indefinitely. That answer is also false. Short-term memory stores what we consciously recognize, but for only 30 seconds, unless we encode it into long-term memory.
And our 4th question, faces are easier to recognize than names. I'll bet a lot of our viewers got that one wrong. The answer is actually false. Although it's widely thought that we remember faces more easily, researchers in New York and the UK have shown that faces are no easier to remember than names. And we can remember names just as easily as faces.
Now for a bonus question that's kind of fun. This is multiple choice, and the question is, what do you do when you're at an event and you see someone you know you've met before, but you can't remember their name. Happens to all of us.
We have all been there. So you're going to get three choices here. Is it A, B, or C? A is hide from them. B, do you ask them their name? Or C, do you greet them while avoiding using names? Well, the correct answer is B. You reintroduce yourself and simply say, please tell me your name again. By doing this, you show interest in them and you create a rapport in what is often an uncomfortable situation for all of us.
Absolutely. Well, how can we be effective when we're working with unfamiliar names? Kyle Hopkins, Tero lead trainer, grew up in Asia, has family in Europe, and has worked around the world. We asked Kyle what are some considerations in remembering names globally.
When working internationally and trying to remember names that don't seem natural to you, they might sound foreign, I found a couple of tips that work well for me. For one, it sounds simple, but try to spell it right. Sometimes the spelling is different, the letters have different sounds, so I make sure to write it down or put it in my address book with the correct spelling. Also, a lot of names around the world have meanings, history, stories behind them. I try to learn what's the meaning behind this name. Maybe I won't remember the name exactly, but the more I get the context of the meaning of that name, the story behind that name, the more I can associate that with that person. And I have a lot of interesting information about that person that I can share with them and learn more from them about that history, the meaning of their name. Also on my computer, I have different languages because often names have accent marks. I in fact was working with somebody and I didn't put the accent mark on their name several times, and finally in the meeting he said, you know what, this is my name and you're not spelling it right. So what I did is I just downloaded that language, and every time I typed their name I can use the correct accent mark, and that helped me remember it correctly. And those are my three tips that I use every day when working with names that at first don't seem familiar to us. After time, it can be quite normal and natural.
Now for three top tips for remembering names from Tero's Outclass Your Competition workshop. Number one, know your motivation. Why are you in the presence of this person? Are they a potential client, a colleague, somebody new in the community? Attach some context to the name and check your reason why you're meeting who you're meeting before the introductions even start.
Number two, focus on the person you are talking to. Dr. Gary Small, a professor of psychiatry of the UCLA Longevity Center, says, you don't stand a chance to remember a new name if you are daydreaming about your weekend plans. Focus your mind, take the time to pay attention, and if you're distracted, the information you want to recall later will never get into your brain's memory storage file cabinets.
And tip number three, link the new name with something that you already know. Connecting a new name to a person or an object that's already stored in your memory is another way to anchor that name in your memory. So think of a connection between the person's name and anything at all that you already know. And we really do mean anything. So the name Carol might make you think about holiday carols. It might make you think of Carol Burnett. And thinking of that connection between the name and literally anything else that you already know will really help to make that name stick in your mind.
What's that mental link?
Yes.
Well, there's so many tips for remembering names, but the foundation of all of them is being present enough to focus and to be motivated to want to remember the name. For our final thought, we are tapping thoughts from an article originally published in The Atlantic. University of Aberdeen researchers measured how people interpreted being forgotten. At the beginning of the school year, they asked students to keep a journal for 2 weeks detailing every time their name was forgotten. The results published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology suggest that forgetting someone does send the message everyone fears. You weren't interested in that person enough to remember things about them. Those who were forgotten reported decreased sense of belonging and meaning in the world. As one student remarked, it's an insult, even though it's completely innocent. By forgetting, you just told that person they're a zero. Let's take this one step further. Being forgotten takes a toll on people who deal with it often, especially if it coincides with other elements of discrimination. The researchers' earliest inspiration for looking into forgetting came from witnessing a professor constantly mixing up the names of two of his non-white graduate students. The Atlantic article stated the big question for scientists isn't why people forget, but why people remember certain things. And the big question for all of us is, why aren't we interested enough in those around us to remember something as simple yet as important as a name? For more on this important topic, check out Chapter 14 of the book, Your Invisible Toolbox.